The CEO brought his heel down on the old man's tool, and the steel snapped like a bone. The sound carried up 40 feet of marble to the coffered ceiling and came back down into a lobby gone dead silent. 40 years of careful order lay scattered across the floor. A brass caliper still spinning. A loop rolled to a stop on its cord. And the calibration driver, the one a dying master had pressed into this man's hands in 1962, broken clean in two beneath an expensive shoe. 3 phones were already filming. The old man did not shout. He did not raise his hands. He was 68 years old in a faded flannel shirt, and the man who had just destroyed his life's work stood over him in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a month, waiting, wanting to be shouted at. It would have made it easier. A man who shouts back can be shouted down. Elijah Calloway lowered himself instead, slowly on knees that had given him 50 winters of opinions, one hand flat on the cold marble, and he began to gather his broken tools. In order, smallest to largest, the way you tend to something hurt. The whole lobby watched a powerful man become smaller by the second, because there is nothing in this world that exposes cruelty like silence answering it. What the CEO did not know, what no one in that gleaming building knew, was that the man, kneeling on his floor, had built the lock on the vault 3 stories beneath their feet. That a contract older than the CEO required this exact pair of hands, and that in 7 hours, a number with a comma in it, $3,847,120.50 was going to land on that marble like a verdict. The old man stood. He looked at the CEO the way you look at weather, and he said 6 quiet words before he walked out the door. But to understand why those 6 words ended a man, you have to go back to 7 o'clock that morning, before any of it, back to when the lobby of Whitmore Heritage Trust belonged to no one but the light. It came through the tall east windows in long pale bars, sliding across the marble floor the way it had for 54 years. And Elijah Calloway liked to arrive before anyone else, so he could watch it move. He was 68 years old. He set his canvas tool roll on the velvet runner he carried with him, unrolled it across the low table beneath the lobby's great standing clock, and laid out his instruments one by one, in the same order he had laid them out for 40 years. The screwdrivers first, smallest to largest, then the brass calipers, the loop on its cord, the tweezers with the bent tip he had ground himself in 1974. Then last, wrapped in its own square of chamois, the calibration driver. He set it down the way some set down a photograph of someone they had lost. His hands shook a little now. They had not shaken in 1971. But the shaking lived only in the resting. The moment his fingers closed on a tool, the tremor vanished, the way a current goes still the instant it finds its channel. He opened the brass door at the base of the standing clock, reached in past the weights, and laid 2 fingers against the escapement to feel its rhythm before he ever looked at it. A watchmaker listens before he sees. "You're early, Eli," said a voice behind him. "You're always early." Margaret Doyle was 71 and had been the archivist of Whitmore Heritage Trust, since before it was called that, back when it was Hartford, Provident, and Trust, and the men on the board wore the same suit 4 days a week and thought no one noticed. She carried 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed him one without asking how he took it, because she had known how he took it since the Nixon administration. Black. No sugar. Hot enough to hurt. "The clock's running 8 seconds fast," Eli said. "She does that when the weather turns." Brass remembers the cold. "The clock," said Margie, "has been running 8 seconds fast since 1989, and you have been telling me about it since 1989, and I have never once cared." He smiled at that. It was an old joke between them, worn smooth as a river stone. Around them, the building began to wake. The marble lobby of Whitmore Heritage Trust was the kind of room built to make a person feel small in the presence of money. 40 feet to the coffered ceiling, a floor quarried from a single Vermont seam, brass fittings polished every dawn by a man named Caesar, who had also been there longer than most of the executives. The staff who crossed it wore tailored wool and walked fast, the way people walk when they have decided in advance that nothing in the room is worth slowing down for. None of them slowed down for Eli. To them, he was the old man in the faded flannel shirt who fussed over the lobby clock, a piece of building maintenance with a pulse. No more remarkable than the radiators. They did not know what he was. That was the thing about the room. The room had been built to broadcast importance, and it was very bad at recognizing the real thing when the real thing wore worn-down boots. A young teller named Marcus had drawn the early shift and was setting up his station at the far counter. He was 23, and knew enough to still be curious, which the building would cure him of soon enough. He watched Eli reach into the clock with the calibration driver and could not help himself. "What is that you're doing, exactly?" Marcus asked. "If you don't mind." Eli did not look up. "Setting the beat," he said. "A clock like this one doesn't keep time the way your phone does. Your phone counts a crystal humming 3 million times a second. This counts a pendulum, and a pendulum is an honest thing. It swings on gravity alone, and gravity doesn't lie and doesn't run out of battery. But honest things drift. Temperature, dust, a truck going by on the avenue. So somebody has to come and listen and bring it back to true. And that's your job. That's part of my job." He withdrew the driver, wiped it on the chamois, and set it back in its place in the roll. "The clock's the small thing. The clock's just so I have a reason to be in the building." Marcus didn't understand that, and Eli didn't explain it, and that was the first small hook of the morning. The kind of thing you notice until later, when it turns out to be the whole story. Here is what the building did not know about the old man and his tool roll. In the autumn of 1970, Hartford Provident and Trust had a problem that money could not directly solve. They were building a new headquarters, and the heart of that headquarters was to be a vault. Not the decorative cage that banks put in their lobbies for show, but the real thing, 3 floors down, walls of layered steel and concrete, meant to hold the deposits and the deeds and the bearer bonds of half the old families in Connecticut. They had the steel, they had the concrete. What they did not have was a lock worthy of it. The lock was the problem. Any vault can be opened by the man who knows its mechanism, and so the men who built the great vaults of that era had learned to remove the human from the equation, the time lock. The idea was old. A Detroit banker named James Sargent had patented the first practical one in 1873. After a wave of robberies in which thieves had simply kidnapped a bank manager and his family, and held them until the terrified man opened the vault himself. Sargent's insight was brutal and elegant. If the lock could not be opened by anyone until a certain hour had passed, if not even the bank president himself could open it, then there was no point in kidnapping the bank president. The vault would open when the clock said so. And the clock could not be threatened, could not be bribed, could not be made to feel fear for its children. By 1970, the principle was a century old, and the trade that practiced it had narrowed to a handful of men in the entire country who could build a time lock fit for a vault that size. The board of Hartford Provident asked the best 3 2-cent estimates. The third drove up from a workshop in New Haven in a borrowed truck, walked the empty vault chamber for a full hour without saying anything, laid his hand flat against the cold inner door and said, "I'll build you something nobody alive can open against the clock. Not me, not you, not God in a hurry. But you have to let me build it my way, and you have to call me back every 10 years to keep it honest. Because a mechanism this stubborn will outlive every man in this room, and a thing that outlives its maker needs a hand it trusts." The third man was 33 years old. His name was Elijah Calloway, and he was the grandson of a man who had been born into slavery in Virginia and had learned clockwork, repairing the plantation's tall case clock, because the family that owned him could not be bothered to learn it themselves. That grandfather had bought clockwork tools with the first wages he ever earned as a free man, and those tools, some of them, were in the canvas roll on the velvet runner in the lobby of Whitmore Heritage. Trust on the morning this story takes place. The bent-tip tweezers, the smallest screwdriver, and the calibration driver, wrapped in chamois, which was the one Eli's own master, a German-trained horologist named Hess, who had taken in a black apprentice in 1958 when no one else in the trade would, had pressed into his hands the week before he died. This one finds the truth, Hess had said. Don't let anyone who doesn't understand it ever touch it. Eli had built the vault lock his way. It had taken him 14 months. And for 54 years, every 10 years, the bank had called him back to keep it honest. And he had come and laid his hand flat against the cold inner door and listened. The last recalibration had been 10 years ago, almost to the day. Margie lingered by the standing clock longer than her schedule allowed. She watched Eli's hands and thought, not for the first time, that there were maybe 4 people left in the building who knew what those hands had made 3 floors below them. And 3 of those 4 were going to retire this year, and one of them was her. They've got a new one upstairs, she said. Did you hear? A new what? A new Whitmore. Brant, old Mr. Whitmore's grandson, came in from the holding company in Stamford to run the place. 40-something. They had a breakfast for him Tuesday. Ice sculpture. She said, ice sculpture, the way you'd report a body found in a river. Eli kept working. They have a new somebody every few years. The building doesn't change. This one's different, Eli. This one's the kind that walks through a room measuring it. She set down her empty cup. He's been through the whole place with a clipboard. Cost per square foot. He stood in my archive for 10 minutes Wednesday and asked me what the room generates. She let that sit. Generates. And what did you tell him? I told him it generates the entire legal history of every account this institution has held since 1919. And that the day he needs one of those documents and it isn't there, the room will have generated more than he makes in a decade. Margie smoothed her skirt. He wrote something down. I don't think it was that. She paused, and something crossed her face that Eli had learned, over 50 years, to read as the look she got when a thing she'd buried came back up. He didn't come down alone, either. Pruitt walked him through the building. Eli's hands went still over the clockwork for just a moment. Gerald Pruitt's still on the board. Gerald Pruitt will be on that board until they carry him out of the room, and probably after. Margie's voice had gone flat the way it did around the few people in the world she did not trust. 40 years on the audit committee. Knows where every body's buried because he buried half of them himself. And he had his hand on the new boy's shoulder the whole tour. I lie, the way a man does when he's deciding to use somebody. She picked up her empty cup. I don't like it when Gerald Pruitt takes an interest in someone young and certain of himself. It usually means he's found a hand to hold a knife he doesn't want his own prints on. Eli said nothing for a while. He knew the name. Everyone who had been in the building long enough knew the name. Gerald Pruitt had been the man on the audit committee in the 90s when the institution had gone through its lean years. The man who had a gift for making a quarter look better than it was. For moving a liability into a footnote, and a footnote into a drawer. Eli had never had proof of anything. He had only the small private fact that somewhere in the early 90s the bank had simply, quietly, stopped paying his license fee the way the contract said it should. Not refused it, not disputed it, just stopped, the way a thing stops when someone has decided it is easier to pretend it isn't owed. He had let it go. He had been a younger man then, with a young man's reasons for not making trouble in rooms that were not built to hear him. He had kept coming every 10 years anyway because the clock didn't care who paid, and his word didn't have a price tag stapled to it. But he had always wondered, in the back of the long quiet of his work, who exactly had decided to stop paying him. And he had always in that same back quiet suspected he knew the name. Eli almost laughed. Then he looked, for just a moment, at the brass door at the base of the standing clock, and through it, in his mind, 3 floors down, to the cold inner door of the vault and the mechanism behind it that was due, that was, in fact, this very week, to be brought back to true. She's due her tune-up, he said quietly. Thursday. The clock? No, said Eli, not the clock. But he didn't explain that either, and Margie, who had learned over 50 years when Eli was holding a thing back to keep from worrying her, didn't push. She filed it away. She was an archivist. Filing things away that turned out to matter was the entire art of her life. Brant Whitmore came down to the lobby at 9:40 that morning because the lobby was on his list. He had a list. He had been running Whitmore Heritage Trust for 11 days, and he had a list of everything in it that did not, in his phrase, earn its footprint. He was 44, and he had not built the holding company that had sent him here, nor the bank, nor the fortune, underneath, both. He had inherited the right to manage them, which is a different thing, though men who inherit it rarely feel the difference. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Marcus the teller made in 2 months, and he wore it the way a man wears armor he has never been tested in. He saw the old man first as an obstacle. There was a person crouched at the base of the standing clock, with tools spread across a square of cloth on a table in the lobby, in the sight line of every client who walked through the front doors. And to Brant, this was simply wrong, the way a stain is wrong, the way a thing out of place is wrong, to a man who has decided his whole value is keeping things in place. "Whose is this?" Brant said. Not to Eli, to the room to Marcus, who had frozen at his counter. Eli looked up. "Good morning," he said. "I asked whose this is." Brant gestured at the tool roll, the velvet runner, the open clock. "Who authorized maintenance in the client lobby during business hours?" "I'm the horologist," Eli said. He said it plainly, without weight the way you'd state the weather. "I service the building's clock. And 1 or 2 other things. I've done it a long while. I come early, so I'm out of the way, but the clock asked for a little extra this morning, so—" "It's 9:40, Brant said. "You're not out of the way. You're in the middle of my lobby with—" He looked at the tools, the worn roll, the old man's faded flannel, and the boots gone pale at the toe, with a yard sale. Marcus, at the counter, looked at his own shoes. Margie, who had been halfway to the elevator, stopped. Eli did not stand up fast, and he did not stand up slow. He simply finished the turn he was making on the calibration screw. You do not stop a calibration in the middle, the way you do not stop a stitch in the middle. And then he set the driver down on the chamois and rose, with the care of a man whose knees had given him 50 winters of opinions. "I'll pack up," he said. "No trouble. I'll come back before hours tomorrow." He began, unhurried, to roll the velvet. "But I'd ask you to let me finish one thing first, because there's a piece of work in this building that's on a schedule older than either of us, and it doesn't keep bankers' hours." It was the wrong sentence to say to Brant Whitmore, not because it was disrespectful, because it was calm, because it did not flinch. Brant had come down to the lobby braced for a fight, and the old man had declined to give him one, and that, the refusal to be afraid of him, was the thing Brant could not stand. Men like Brant do not feel powerful when others obey. They feel powerful when others are afraid, and Elijah Calloway, 68 years old in a faded flannel shirt, was not afraid of him, and everyone in the lobby could see it. So Brant reached down and he swept the tool roll off the table. The tools went across the marble floor with a sound like rain made of metal. 40 years of order, smallest to largest, each in its sewn pocket, scattered in a second across the Vermont stone. The brass calipers spun. The loop rolled on its cord. The bent-tip tweezers skidded under the velvet rope by the manager's desk. And the calibration driver, the one wrapped in chamois, the one Hess had pressed into Eli's hands in 1962, with his dying breath and an instruction, "Don't let anyone who doesn't understand it ever touch it," came free of its cloth and slid to a stop in the open floor. And Brant Whitmore, making his point, brought his heel down on it. The steel didn't bend. Steel like that doesn't bend. It snapped. A clean break, just above the ground tip, the working end. The part Eli's master had hand-finished on a stone the year Eli was born, spinning away across the marble while the handle stayed pinned under the CEO's shoe. The whole lobby heard it. The little crack of it carried up to the coffered ceiling and came back down. 3 phones were already up. This is the thing the powerful keep forgetting in this particular age of the world, that the audience is no longer just the room. A client by the door had started filming the moment. Brant raised his voice, on instinct, the way people do now. A junior associate on the mezzanine had her phone out over the rail. And Marcus, the 23-year-old teller who had been told to look at his shoes, had quietly lifted his phone below the counter and was recording the marble floor, the scattered tools, and the old man. Here is what they filmed. They did not film an outburst. That is what makes the video, later, impossible to look away from, what makes it travel the way it travels. Eli Calloway did not shout. He did not clutch his chest or raise his hands or say a single word in his own defense. He looked at the broken thing on the floor for the length of one slow breath, and then he lowered himself, carefully, on those 50 winter knees, one hand on the cold marble, and he began to gather his tools. He gathered them in order, smallest to largest. He reached under the velvet rope for the bent-tip tweezers and wiped the floor, dust from them on his sleeve, and set them in their pocket. He retrieved the calipers, checked them with the light to see if the fall had sprung them, and finding them true, set them in their place. He worked the way a man works at the bedside of something hurt. The lobby had gone so quiet that the standing clock above him, the one that ran 8 seconds fast, was the loudest thing in the room. Brant stood over him through all of it, and the standing over got worse the longer it went, because the old man's calm was rewriting the scene out from under the CEO in real time. A man who shouts back can be shouted down. A man who weeps can be dismissed. But a man who kneels in silence and gathers his broken things with dignity turns every person watching into a witness, and turns the man standing over him into exactly what he is. Margie crossed the lobby. She did not hurry. She had decided something, and people who have decided something do not hurry. She knelt beside Eli, in her good skirt on the public floor, and picked up the chamois cloth and the broken working tip of the calibration driver, and folded the one around the other as gently as you'd wrap a wound. She did not look at Brant. She would not give him her eyes. She handed Eli the wrapped piece, and he took it, and for one moment the two old people knelt together on the marble, with 50 years between them and the whole bright lobby holding its breath. Then Eli finished rolling his tools and tied the canvas and stood. He looked at Brant Whitmore, not with hatred, which would have been a kind of gift, a thing Brant could have used. He looked at him the way you look at weather, and he said the only words he said in the entire lobby that morning. 6 of them, quiet enough that the phones nearly missed it, and clear enough that they didn't. "You may want to keep that piece, sir." Then he walked out through the tall front doors into the cold, and the bars of pale light closed behind him across the marble, and the standing clock ran on, 8 seconds fast, the way it had since 1989. What Brant Whitmore did not know, what he had no way of knowing, because he had spent 11 days measuring the building's square footage and 0 minutes learning what was in it, was that he had just snapped the personal tool of the one living human being permitted, by a contract older than he was, to recalibrate the vault 3 floors below his feet, and that the window to do it closed at the end of the day. Dev Okafor found out at 10:15, which was already too late to be calm about it. Dev ran operations, which at an institution like this means he was the man who actually knew how the building worked, as opposed to the men who owned it. He was 40, meticulous, and he had spent his first week under the new CEO, developing the specific stomach pain of a competent person, watching an incompetent one pull levers he doesn't understand. When the lobby story reached him, second-hand, breathless, from a junior associate, Dev did not react to the human cruelty of it first. That came later and hard. What he reacted to first was a date. He went down to his office, and he opened the maintenance master, the real one, the paper one that Margie kept a duplicate of in her archive, and he ran his finger down the column he hoped he was wrong about. He was not wrong about it. Occult mechanism, Calloway, horological psyche, decennial recalibration, and the date. And the note beside the date in a hand that had been photocopied forward through 5 decades of files. Fail secure. Window, 72-S. Recalibration by patent holder or designated successor only. Lapse mechanical lockdown, 90 days, no override. Dev sat very still and did the arithmetic that the whole rest of the day would be built on. The 10-year mark had come up 3 days ago. The 72-hour window. The grace period Eli himself had built into the mechanism in 1971, because even he had known a man might be sick or snowed in on the exact day, closed at end of business today. If the Calloway mechanism was not recalibrated by the man named in the contract before the bank closed its doors this evening, the vault would seal itself. Not for an hour. Not until a locksmith could be flown in. For 90 days, by design. by a design built specifically so that no pressure, no threat, no emergency, and no CEO could force it open 1 minute before the mechanism decided the world was honest again. Dev picked up the phone to call the CEO's office, and then he understood the second part of the arithmetic, and he put the phone down. The man who could recalibrate it had just been driven out of the building by the CEO, who had broken his tools. Here is the part Brant Whitmore should have been taught and never was, the part Dev Okafor understood in his bones, the part that turns this from a story about a rude man into a story about consequences with teeth. A vault time lock is not a lock you open. It is a lock you negotiate with in advance. You set the terms when you build it, and from then on the mechanism honors the terms and nothing else. Not the owner, not the law, not the urgent. That is the entire point of it. Its uselessness in an emergency is its value. The Calloway mechanism 3 floors down had a second feature, rarer and stranger, that Eli had built at the bank's own 1971 request after a competitor's vault in Bridgeport had been compromised by a crooked locksmith on the inside. They had asked Eli for a lock that no outside locksmith could service, so he had given them one keyed to a single unrepeatable thing. The calibration signature of his own hand, his own tools, recorded mechanically into the escapement on the day he built it, reconfirmed every 10 years. The mechanism didn't just need a recalibration, it needed his, or that of a successor he formally designated in writing, by the terms of the contract, in advance. And Eli, who trusted almost no one with the chamois-wrapped driver, had designated exactly one successor in 54 years, and that fact was sitting in Margie Doyle's archive too, though no one had thought to look for it yet. This is what Brant had walked over with his clipboard and never seen. The most valuable security asset the institution owned was not the steel and not the concrete. It was an agreement, on paper, with an old man in a flannel shirt, and he had just sent the old man home. Dev went to find Margie. He found her already pulling files. The archive of Whitmore Heritage Trust was 2 floors below the lobby and 1 floor above the vault, a long, low room of gray steel shelving that smelled of paper and time, and Margaret Doyle stood at the end of it with a banker's box already open on the table, and her reading glasses pushed up into her white hair. She had not waited to be asked. She had filed away the word Thursday that Eli had said by the standing clock, and the moment she'd knelt on the marble and folded the broken tip into the chamois, the file had come back up out of her memory whole. "You know," she said, without turning, when she heard Dev's careful footsteps. "Good. Then I don't have to convince you. The recalibration window closes at 5. She lifted a folder, the cardboard gone soft and tan with age, and laid it on the table with both hands, the way you'd lay down something that could break. The tab, typed on a machine that no longer existed, read, Calloway Horologicalic, Master Surface and License Agreement, 1971 Original. And here is the thing your CEO doesn't know he stepped on. Dev opened it. It was all there, 54 years of it, in the careful over-formal English of 1971 contracts. The construction of the mechanism, the decennial recalibration clause, the fail-secure provision spelled out in a full paragraph, so that no future executive could claim surprise. And Dev's finger stopped. The license. The mechanism was not the bank's property. It had never been the bank's property. Eli Calloway had built it under a license, the way a great architect sometimes retains the rights to a building's most singular feature, and the bank paid an annual licensing fee for the continued use of the Calloway mechanism, a fee that Dev flipped to the schedule, and the schedule had been amended in pen decade after decade, initialed each time, had quietly compounded across 54 years, according to a formula no one currently employed by the bank had been alive to negotiate. "Margie," Dev said slowly, "when was the last time anyone actually paid the license fee?" Margaret Doyle smiled for the first time that day, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an archivist who has been waiting, without quite knowing it, 50 years for a single morning. 1994, she said. "And here is the part you'll want to sit down for." She drew out a second folder, thinner, its tab marked only with a year and a set of initials, because the fee wasn't dropped by accident. Somebody dropped it on purpose. and somebody papered over the hole so the auditors wouldn't trip on it, and that somebody initialed the reclassification. Because in 1994, it never occurred to him that an old man's contract would ever come back to bite the institution. Look at the initials, Dev. Dev looked. 3 letters, in faded blue ballpoint, on a reclassification memo that had quietly moved the Calloway licensing liability off the books and into a maintenance footnote where no examiner would ever think to look for a multi-million-dollar obligation. G.P. Gerald Pruitt, Dev said. Gerald Pruitt, Margie agreed. Who is, at this moment, 2 floors above us, telling that frightened boy of a CEO exactly how to handle today. Which I promise you means telling him how to make this go away quietly, because Gerald Pruitt has spent 30 years making sure no one ever asks why the Calloway fee disappeared, and the one thing in the world he cannot survive is a federal examiner pulling this exact thread on this exact afternoon. She squared the 2 folders together. Do you understand what we're holding, Dev? This isn't an unpaid invoice. An unpaid invoice is an accident. This is a deliberate, decades-long misstatement of a material liability, initialed by a sitting member of the audit committee, and it is about to detonate under a man who thinks his only problem today is a sealed vault. Dev sat down after all. He doesn't know, Dev said slowly. Brant. He doesn't know about any of this. He thinks he just insulted a maintenance man. No, said Margie. He doesn't know. Which is the only innocent thing about him today. And Gerald Pruitt is counting on keeping him that way. Because a CEO who panics quietly is useful, and a CEO who understands what he's standing on top of might start asking who put him there. Now, she slid the folders into the envelope. There is a federal examiner arriving at 2 o'clock this afternoon for the quarterly trust audit. She is going to ask to physically verify the contents of that vault against the custody ledger. It's routine. She does it every quarter. And if that vault is sealed when she asks, sealed by our own mechanism, 90 days, no override, 3 days after a recalibration we missed, then we can't produce the custodied assets on demand. Dev finished and felt the floor of the day drop out from under him. Which isn't his embarrassment, which is a finding, a federal finding. And once she has a finding, Margie said softly, she has a reason to look. And once she has a reason to look, Gerald Pruitt's initials are sitting right here in this drawer, waiting for her. The sealed vault is the small disaster, Dev. The sealed vault is just the thing that opens the door to the big one. A man broke an old man's tools to feel tall in his lobby, Margie said, sliding the folder into a fresh envelope. And he may have handed the regulators the worst audit day this institution has had since the war. Now, are you going to help me? Or are you going to go protect your career? Dev Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then, he took off his suit jacket, which is the thing competent men do right before they decide to ruin their afternoon for the right reasons, and he rolled up his sleeves. Where does Eli live? He said. While they searched the archive for the successor designation, because calling Eli back was the obvious move and the dignified move and possibly, given what had just been done to him, the impossible move. Brant Whitmore was making the situation in the way that men like Brant always do, by trying to solve it cheaply. He had not yet been told about the audit. He had been told by a nervous Dev who tried the front door of reason first, only that the lobby man was contractually required for a vault surface due that day, and that it would be wise to apologize and ask him back. Brant had heard the words contractually required, and the lobby man, in the same sentence, and rejected the sentence whole. He did not believe that the building security could possibly depend on the man he had just thrown out. It offended his entire model of the world. So he did what his model of the world told him to do. He called a locksmith, a good one. The most expensive one in Hartford, because Brant believed, as men like Brant believe, that any problem is simply a price. The locksmith's name was Ray Petrosky, and he had been opening difficult things for 30 years. And he came within the hour, because the most expensive locksmith in Hartford answers when Whitmore Heritage Trust calls. Dev took him down to the vault himself, partly out of duty, and partly because he wanted badly to watch a professional confirm what he already knew. Ray Petrosky stood in front of the cold inner door of the vault for a long time. He ran his light across the mechanism housing. He found the maker's mark, a small, deep-struck C inside a circle, the kind of mark a man only strikes into work he is willing to be judged by in 100 years. And Ray Petrosky, the most expensive locksmith in Hartford, took a step back from the door and let out a breath and laughed, once, not happily. "Who told you to call me?" Ray said. "The CEO," said Dev. "Yeah, well." Ray shook his head and started packing up the bag he had not even fully opened. "You go tell the CEO something for me. You tell him this isn't a lock you pick." He nodded at the small struck. "See, this is a Calloway. You don't open a Calloway against the clock. That's the whole reason it exists. I've been doing this 30 years, and I've seen exactly 2 of them, and I wouldn't put a pick near either one. Because the man who built these built them specifically so that guys like me couldn't. There's one human being on God's earth supposed to touch this mechanism, and it sure as hell isn't me." He zipped the bag. "Whoever he is, I'd find him. I'd find him today, and if I were the man who called me instead of him, I'd think hard about how I was going to say I'm sorry." He left. Dev stood alone in front of the cold door with the small struck. C 3 floors down, and looked at the maker's mark of the old man, whose tools were, at that moment, broken and wrapped in chamois in a flannel pocket on a bus going north out of the city, and he understood that the entire afternoon now came down to whether Elijah Calloway could be persuaded to come back to the building that had just humiliated him, and do it for free, out of nothing but the kind of character the building had never once bothered to notice he had. What Dev did not see, because it was happening 40 feet above his head behind a closed office door, was Gerald Pruitt getting to the new CEO first. Pruitt was 76, and moved like a man who had never once been in a hurry in his life, because hurry is for people who are not certain of the outcome. He had heard about the lobby within the hour. Gerald Pruitt heard about everything within the hour, and he had come down from the board floor, not to fix it, but to shape it. He found Brant Whitmore at his desk, with the beginnings of real fear on him, and Gerald Pruitt sat down across from that fear, and began gently to use it. "You're going to hear a great deal of noise today about an old contract," Pruitt said. "Maintenance people, the archivist. They love their little documents down there. It's all they have. I want you to remember something, son, because your grandfather would have wanted me to look out for you." He let the name of the grandfather sit in the air, where it would do the most work. "Whatever they tell you that vault costs, whatever number Doyle comes upstairs waving, you do not under any circumstances sign anything today. You don't acknowledge a debt. You don't put anything on paper. You get that vault open by whatever quiet means necessary. You get the examiner her look, you send her on her way, and then you let the lawyers spend the next 2 years deciding some handshake from 1971 means anything at all. Paper is the enemy today, Brant. The instant you put your name to that old man's number, you've turned a maybe into a fact, and facts have to be reported." He smiled, grandfatherly, terrible. "Keep it a maybe. Mabes don't show up on an audit." It was, in its way, brilliant advice. Brilliant the way a thing is brilliant, when it is designed to protect the man giving it rather than the man receiving it. Because what Gerald Pruitt could not say, sitting across that desk, was that the single most dangerous document in the building was not the 1971 contract at all. It was a reclassification memo from 1994 with his own initials on it, sitting in a drawer 2 floors down, and every instinct in his 76-year-old body was bent toward one thing: making sure no one signed anything, acknowledged anything, or pulled any thread today that might lead a federal examiner's eye back to a quiet little piece of paper marked G.P. Brant, frightened and grateful for a steady old hand, nodded. He did not yet know he was being handled. That would come later, and it would cost him to learn it, and it would be, though he could not have believed it that afternoon, the most useful thing anyone taught him all year. Dev, 3 floors down, dialed Eli's number again. It rang in an empty kitchen and went unanswered, and the standing clock in the lobby read 1:40, and the examiner was due at 2. The federal examiner's name was Caroline Reyes, and she was punctual in the way of people who have learned that punctuality is its own kind of authority. She arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, signed the visitor log in her own pen, declined coffee, and asked, as she asked every quarter, to verify the custodied trust assets against the ledger. It was the most routine sentence in her professional vocabulary. She had no idea she had walked into the worst afternoon in the building's modern history, because the people who knew had not yet decided how much to tell her, which is itself a decision regulators take a dim view of. Caroline Reyes had been examining trust institutions for 19 years, and the single most useful instrument she owned was not in her bag. It was the small, quiet sense she had developed for the specific texture of a building that was hiding something. It was never the documents that gave it away first. It was the people. The way a competent operations man got a little too smooth. The way a delay got described as routine by someone whose pulse said otherwise. The way the air in a place changed when a number of people were all carefully not mentioning the same thing. She had felt that texture the moment she walked into the Whitmore lobby, and she had not yet decided what it meant, and she was a patient woman. She had learned that the surest way to find what an institution was hiding was to behave very calmly, as though yet all after, because frightened people cannot bear a calm examiner. They start filling the silence. They always start filling the silence. Dev met her in the lobby. He was very calm, in the way of a man standing on a frozen pond who has decided that the only safe move is to walk normally. He told her the vault verification might take a little longer than usual today, a maintenance matter. Caroline Reyes wrote something in her notebook. Regulators always write something when you say a thing will take longer than usual. It is rarely good for you what they write. But she did not press. She set her bag on a lobby chair, took out the custody ledger, and began, unhurried, to review the quarter's entries, and to watch over the top of her reading glasses the choreography of a building full of people trying very hard to look like nothing was wrong. She noticed the old archivist come up from the lower floors twice, each time carrying an envelope she did not set down. She noticed the operations man check his phone every 90 seconds, with the particular rhythm of a man waiting on a call that meant everything. She noticed an elderly board member she recognized from prior audits. Pruitt, she had a long memory for the men who served on audit committees, descend to the executive floor and not come back, which was unusual because Gerald Pruitt was a man who liked to be visible to examiners, liked to shake a hand and make a warm remark. And a Gerald Pruitt who was suddenly making himself scarce was a far more interesting Gerald Pruitt than the one she was used to. Caroline Reyes wrote 3 small notes to herself, closed her notebook, and waited. She was very good at waiting. Upstairs, the situation had finally fully reached Brant Whitmore, not the human shape of it, which still didn't touch him, but the institutional shape, which did. Dev had gone up and laid it out flat on the CEO's desk in 4 sentences, because there was no longer time for the diplomacy of the morning. The vault would self-seal at 5. The only person who could prevent it was the man Brant had thrown out of the lobby. A federal examiner was in the building right now, who would record it as a finding if the vault could not be opened on demand. And the maintenance man, whom Brant had so confidently dismissed as a yard sale in his lobby, held the license to the single most important security asset the bank owned. A license whose fees Margie had now confirmed with the ledger in her hand had not been properly paid in a manner consistent with the contract since 1994. Brant Whitmore did something in that office that the rest of this story will not pretend was a transformation. He did not a good man between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Men do not. What happened to Brant was narrower and more human than that. He became afraid, not ashamed. Fear and shame are not the same organ, but afraid, in the specific way of a man who has just understood that the floor he was standing on to look down at someone was never his floor, and is being pulled out from under him by a contract he never read, signed by men who were better at their jobs than he is at his. "Get him back," Brant said. "I'm trying," said Dev. "Get him back. Offer him, I don't care. Offer him money. What's his rate? Double it, triple it." And here Margaret Doyle, who had come up with Dev, and had been standing by the door of the CEO's office the whole time saying nothing, finally spoke. and her voice was the quietest thing that had happened all day. You think he didn't come back yet because of money she's. It was not a question. Mr. Whitmore. That man rebuilt the beat of your grandfather's vault for 54 years on a fee you stopped honoring before you finished college. And he kept coming anyway, every 10 years. Because he gave his word in 1971. And his word turned out to be worth more than this entire board's signatures. You did not insult a vendor this morning. You broke the tools his teacher left him when his teacher died. You will not fix that with a number. You will be lucky, if it can be fixed at all. And the only reason there is any chance of it is that he is a better man than the building he built for, which has been true for 54 years, and which not one of you ever noticed because he came in early and left before you arrived, and never once asked to be seen. The office was silent. Caroline Reyes, 2 floors down, glanced at her watch and wrote something else in her notebook. "Where is he?" Brant said finally. "Smaller now. My grandson is driving to him," Dev said. "He's not answering his phone. Eli never answers his phone." He paused. "But there's one more thing you should know before you decide how to play the next hour, because it changes the arithmetic." He laid a single photocopied page on Brant's desk. He named a successor. Once, in 1971. The only one in 54 years. The contract lets the named successor perform the recalibration in his place, with his tools by his hand-trained method. We found the designation in the archive 20 minutes ago. Brant looked at the page. Then call the successor. Problem solved. We don't even need the old. The successor, Dev said, is his granddaughter, Nora Calloway. He trained her himself on the same tools from the time she was a girl. She's the only other person alive he ever trusted with the chamois driver. Dev let that land. She's 12, Mr. Whitmore. He named her at birth the way his teacher named him, because that's how the trait passes down. By blood and by trust, not by hire. She can't legally execute the contract for 6 more years, which means there is exactly one person on this earth who can save your audit today. He gathered the page back up. And you stepped on his life's work in front of 40 witnesses and 3 phones at 9:40 this morning. Eli Calloway came back to the building at 3:50 in the afternoon. He came back not because Brant's office had reached him. They never did reach him. The phone rang in an empty kitchen in a small house in the north of the city and went on ringing. He came back because Dev's grandson, a polite 19-year-old named Tobias, found him at the bus stop 2 blocks from his home, having ridden the wrong way and gotten off to wait for the southbound. The broken driver still wrapped in his pocket, and said, "Sir, my granddad sent me, and I'm not allowed to come back without you. And he says to tell you it's not for them, it's for the clock." He said you'd know what that meant. Eli knew what that meant. He came back. He came back not for Brant, and not for the board, and not for the license fees that Margie's ledger said the bank now owed him in a number with a comma in it that no one had said out loud yet. He came back for the mechanism 3 floors down, the one he had built with his own hands at 33, the one keyed to the signature of those same hands, the one that would seal itself blind for 90 days at 5 o'clock if no one who loved it came and listened. He came back because the clock had not done anything wrong. The clock never does anything wrong. People do. He walked in through the tall front doors at 3:50, the same doors he had walked out of at 10. And the lobby was very different now, because by 3:50 the lobby knew. The video had done in 5 hours what videos do. Marcus's recording, the marble, the scattered tools, the old man kneeling in silence, the 6 quiet words, had left the building by noon and come back by 3, as a thing the whole staff had watched on their phones in stairwells. They knew now what they had walked past for years, without slowing down. When Eli Calloway came back through the doors, tellers stood up at their stations, not on instruction, on instinct. The same instinct that had told them to look away that morning finally pointed the right direction. It is worth saying plainly what that moment cost the people standing in it, because it is the part the cheap version of this story skips. Every person who stood up at their station that afternoon had also been a person who walked past Eli Calloway for years. Marcus had been curious about him for exactly 1 morning. The associate on the mezzanine had ridden the elevator past him 1,000 times. Caesar, who polished the brass at dawn, was the only one in the lobby who had ever truly seen the old man for what he was, and Caesar had not had the standing to say so to anyone who would listen. So when the staff rose, they were not only honoring Eli, they were confessing something. Confessing that they had needed a video, a humiliation, a near disaster, to make them see a man who had been in front of them the whole time. That is the quiet shame underneath the satisfying image, and Eli, who missed very little, saw it on their faces as he crossed the marble, and was kind enough not to make them feel it more than they already did. Brant Whitmore was waiting in the lobby because Mizuggy had told him, flatly, that if he wanted any chance at all, he would be standing in the place where he had done it, and he would do the one thing his whole life had never required of him, which was to say a true sentence about himself out loud in front of people. He was not good at it. This is the asymmetric part, the part the cheap version of this story always gets wrong. Brant did not fall to his knees. He did not weep. He did not deliver a beautiful apology, because beautiful apologies are a kind of performance, and Brant had run out of performance at about 2:15. What he did was worse for him, and better for the truth. He stood in his expensive suit in the middle of his marble lobby, and he said, stiffly, to the old man, in front of the staff and the mezzanine and Caroline Reyes, who had come up to see what the delay was, "I was wrong about you. I broke your tools. I need your help, and I have no right to ask for it." It was not eloquent. His jaw was tight around it. You could see what it cost him, and you could see that he resented the cost even as he paid it. And that is exactly why it was real. A man who enjoys his apology hasn't given one. Elijah Calloway looked at him for a moment, with that same weather look from the morning. And then he did the thing that made the staff in the lobby remember the afternoon for the rest of their lives. The thing that was larger than any revenge the building's worst-if employees were quietly hoping to see. He reached into his coat, and he took out a second driver. It was wrapped in its own square of chamois, identical to the first. Because a real craftsman, a man who has serviced one irreplaceable mechanism for 54 years, always carries the second of the thing he cannot afford to lose. Hess had taught him that too. Never own one of anything you would weep to break. Eli had wept, a little, on the northbound bus, for the tool his teacher had finished by hand the year he was born. And then he had reached into his other pocket and felt the second one, cold and whole, and known he would still be able to save the clock, whatever the morning had cost him. "I'm not doing this for you," Eli said to Brant, unwrapping it. "I want to be clear, so you don't get the wrong lesson out of today and go on being who you are. I'm doing it for the work. The work didn't insult anybody. The work just keeps honest time 3 floors down and asks to be listened to once a decade. And I gave my word in 1971 that I'd listen, and my word doesn't have an exception in it for the days the building forgets my name." He looked up, and for the first time there was something hard in it. "But you're going to watch. You're going to come down to that vault, and you're going to stand there and watch me do the thing you said. This morning was a yard sale. And then you're going to go upstairs and you're going to find out from Mrs. Doyle exactly what your grandfather's bank has owed me since 1994, and you're going to make it right on paper. The way men who keep their word make things right. That's the price, not the apology. The apology's just words. The price is paper." It was, Caroline Reyes thought, watching from the side with her notebook now closed, the most that she had ever heard a man ask for, and the least he could have asked for, both at once. They went down to the vault, all of them. Eli, Dev, Margie, Brant, and at a careful professional distance, the federal examiner who was no longer in any hurry, because she had realized somewhere around 3:30 that she was watching something she would tell people about for years. The vault chamber was 3 floors below the lobby, and it was cold the way deep rooms are cold, a cold that did not come from weather, but from being far from the sun. The cold inner door stood closed, and on its face, where a casual eye would see only steel, Eli's eye went straight to the small for recessed housing, and the tiny mechanical indicator beside it that no one in the room but he could read. He looked at it for a long moment, Then he said, to no one in particular, in a voice gone very quiet, 26 minutes. 26 minutes until what? Brant said. Until the window closes and she seals herself. Eli set his canvas roll on the small steel table bolted to the chamber wall and unrolled it. And everyone in the cold room watched a man lay out tools with the unhurried precision of someone for whom hurry has never once made a single thing go faster. A recalibration isn't a thing you rush, son. That's the part nobody upstairs ever understands. You can't do it in half the time by being twice as worried. The mechanism doesn't care that you're frightened. It only responds to one thing, and that thing is a steady hand doing the right work in the right order. And a steady hand cannot be frightened. So, he took out the second driver, the whole one, and unwrapped it from its chamois. I'm going to ask everyone in this room to be quiet now. Not for me. For her. He laid his palm flat against the cold steel. She's been listening to silence for 10 years. Let's not insult her on her last 20 minutes of it. What followed was the strangest 15 minutes of Caroline Reyes's 19-year career, and the one she would describe, years later, when younger examiners asked her what she had seen that made her trust her own instincts in a room full of nervous men. She watched an old man open a mechanism she could not have begun to understand. She watched his fingers, which trembled visibly when they were still, go utterly steady the instant they closed on a tool, the tremor vanishing as though it had only ever been the body's way of saving its precision for when it was needed. She watched him work in a silence so complete that the only sounds in the cold chamber were the faint, deliberate clicks of an escapement being coaxed, tooth by tooth, back toward true. And beneath that, if you listened, the soft tick of the small indicator counting down the window. She watched Brant Whitmore, who had crushed this man's tools 9 hours earlier to feel tall in a marble lobby, stand pressed against the chamber wall with his expensive suit forgotten, and his face stripped of everything it usually performed, watching the work he had called a yard sale save the institution his name was on. And she watched the old man pause, once near the end, his hand going still over the open mechanism, his head tilting, listening to something the rest of them could not hear. A long second passed, then another. The little indicator ticked. Brant made a small involuntary sound. There's a tooth here, Eli said softly, to the mechanism more than to the room, that took a knock it shouldn't have. Recently. He did not look up, but every person in the chamber understood. The same blow that had snapped his driver, the morning's violence in the lobby, had traveled somehow into the patience of his hands, and a mechanism this fine could feel even that. Easy now, he murmured to the steel. Easy, not your fault. None of it was your fault. And he made a correction so small that no one watching could have said what his fingers did, and the escapement, which had hesitated, found its rhythm and took it, and settled into the beat it had been built to keep. He closed the housing. He laid his palm flat against the cold door, one last time, the way he had in 1970 before any of them were anything, feeling that the rhythm had taken and would hold. Then he wrapped the second driver in its chamois, rolled his tools, and stepped back. The vault accepted the recalibration with 4 minutes left in the window. Caroline Reyes, who had watched the whole thing without writing a single word, finally opened her notebook. She did not write down anything about the vault. She wrote down a name. The name she wrote down was Prout, because a building does not hold its breath like that all afternoon over an honest delay. And Caroline Reyes had spent 19 years learning that the thing an institution is most desperate to keep sealed is rarely the vault. She asked the vault to open. It opened, smoothly and on demand, exactly as a custodial vault is required by law to open for a federal's examiner. She verified the assets against the ledger. Everything was there. The audit, which had come within 4 minutes of being the worst finding in the institution's modern history, closed clean on the question of the vault. Not because the building had been competent, but because one old man it had humiliated that morning had a second driver in his coat and a word he'd kept for 54 years. But Caroline Reyes did not leave when the vault closed. She asked, in the same calm voice she used for everything, whether she might also see the maintenance and licensing schedules for the vault mechanism. since it seems to be such an important asset. And in the cold silence that followed that request, Gerald Pruitt, standing at the back of the chamber, went a shade of gray that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The reckoning on paper came over the following weeks, and it was quieter than the lobby and far more expensive, and it did not fall hardest on the man who had broken the tools. Margaret Doyle, who had been waiting 50 years without knowing it, walked the board through the 1971 Master Agreement line by line, and then she did the thing Gerald Pruitt had spent 30 years praying no one would ever do. She laid the 1994 reclassification memo down on the same table, beside the contract, so that any person with eyes could see the shape of what had happened. The license fee, properly compounded under the contract's own amended formula across the years the bank had underpaid it, came to a specific and unround number, the kind of number that is unmistakably real precisely because no one would ever invent it. $3,847,120.50. The bank owed it. The contract was airtight. It had been written by a man who built fail-secure mechanisms for a living, and who apparently drafted his agreements the same way he drafted his locks, so that no future pressure, no clever lawyer, no embarrassed CEO could force them open against their own terms. There was no provision for breaking it. That was the whole point of it. That had always been the whole point of everything Elijah Calloway built. But the money was the smaller half of the reckoning. The larger half had Gerald Pruitt's initials on it. Caroline Reyes had requested the licensing schedules in the cold of the vault chamber, and a federal examiner who requests a document gets the document. And once she had it, she did what 19 years had taught her to do, which was to follow the quiet thread in the room. The thread led exactly where her instinct had pointed, to a 1994 memo that had moved a multi-million-dollar liability off the institution's books and into a footnote, initialed by a sitting member of the audit committee, where had sat misstated through 3 decades of financial reports. This was not an unpaid bill. This was a material misstatement, sustained and deliberate, and it was precisely the kind of thing federal examiners exist to find. Gerald Pruitt, who had spent 30 years making sure no one ever pulled this thread, had the singular misfortune of being in the building on the one afternoon, when an old man's broken tools forced the whole tapestry into the light. Pruitt did not go down dramatically. The Esmetic ending is true of him, too. There was no perp walk, no shouting, no moment of confession on the board floor. There was only a man of 76 being quietly removed from every committee he had sat on for 40 years, referred to the regulator for a misstatement he could no longer footnote his way out of, and made to watch his decades-long reputation as the institution's steady hand reorganize itself in a single audit cycle into the truth that he had been the institution's most expensive liability all along, hiding in plain sight, protected by nothing but everyone's assumption that the old man with the warm handshake must be the one telling the truth. He had spent 30 years making sure no one looked too closely at the maintenance contracts. He never imagined the danger would come from the maintenance man. Brant Whitmore was not fired either, and this is the part that is truer than the satisfying version. The board did not perp walk him out to applause. What happened to him was slower, and in its way, heavier. He was formally censured, removed from any role-touching operations, and made, by the board, in writing, as a condition of staying employed at all, to personally oversee the full and immediate payment of the Calloway license, and to sit across the table from the old man while it was done. He did it with the same tight jaw he'd apologized with. He never did become a better man in any way you could photograph. But somewhere in those weeks, watching how Gerald Pruitt fell, Brant learned the one thing that might actually change a man like him. He understood that he had very nearly been used, that the steady grandfatherly hand on his shoulder, the advice to keep it a maybe, sign nothing, it had not been protecting him at all. It had been positioning him, a frightened new CEO, with his name on the door, to take the fall for a misstatement that was 30 years older than his tenure. The old man in the flannel had insulted his pride. The old man on the board had nearly ended his career. Brant spent a long time, that winter, sitting with the difference between those two facts, and the difference was the closest thing to wisdom he ever came by. The license, renegotiated, named Nora Calloway. As successor in formal terms, the bank could no longer treat as a footnote. The tools, the broken driver, were never replaced or repaired. Eli kept the snapped working tip in its chamois on a shelf at home. The last scene of this story is not in the bank. It is in a small kitchen in the north of the city, that same evening, where the light was nothing like the marble lobby's light, just a warm yellow bulb over a worn table, and where a 12-year-old girl named Nora Calloway was doing her math homework while her grandfather cleaned his tools. He cleaned them every night. He laid the canvas roll on the kitchen table and went through them in order, smallest to largest. The way he had that morning in the lobby, and the way he would the next morning, and the way his grandfather had. On the first night, he owned tools as a free man. The broken driver he set on the shelf, beside a photograph of a stern German named Hess, who had taught a black apprentice in 1958 when no one else would. The second driver he wiped clean and rolled away whole. Nora watched him over the top of her math book. She had heard, in the way that children hear things, some of what had happened. Not all of it. Enough. Grandpa, she said. After what that man did, Eli Calloway thought about how to answer that, because it was the realest question anyone had asked him all day, realer than the examiner's questions, realer than the CEO's. He picked up the broken tip in its chamois and turned it over in his old, steady fingers. Because the clock didn't do anything wrong, baby, he said. The man did. But the clock's just sitting down there, keeping honest time, doing exactly what I built it to do, and it doesn't know anything about who's been cruel upstairs. If I let it seal itself for 90 days to teach that man a lesson, the only thing I'd really be doing is letting a bad day break a good clock. And I don't break good clocks. Not for anybody. Not even for being right. He set the broken tip back on the shelf. You'll be the one listening to it someday. When you do, you remember. You don't take it out on the work. The work is innocent. The work is always innocent. People are the only thing in this world that isn't. Nora looked at the broken tip on the shelf for a while. Then she went back to her math, and her grandfather went back to his tools, and 3 floors below an empty marble lobby across the city. A mechanism that no pressure on earth could force kept perfect, honest, recalibrated time in the dark, exactly as it had been built to do by the one pair of hands it had ever trusted. I have told this story a number of times now, and people always want to talk about the number, the 3,847,000 and change, the comma in the middle of it, the satisfying weight of a bank being made to pay an old man what it owed. But that was never the part that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me was the second driver, not the broken one, the whole one, the one he had in his other coat pocket the entire time. From the moment he was humiliated in the lobby to the moment he saved the people who humiliated him. He carried a spare of the one thing he could not afford to lose, because a lifetime of caring about something teaches you to keep one in reserve for the day the world is careless with you. Brant Whitmore walked into that building, owning a great deal, and prepared for nothing. The first real test of his life arrived, and he had no second anything. No humility held back, no character put away for a hard day. Gerald Pruitt had spent 50 years making sure he was never caught, and had no answer at all for the one morning when being caught arrived from a direction he'd never thought to guard. And the old man in the faded flannel, who the whole building had walked past for years without slowing down, had a second driver in his coat, a word he'd kept since 1971, and a granddaughter at a kitchen table who would carry all of it forward. He kept the broken tool on a shelf, unrepaired. I think he kept it broken on purpose, not as a grudge, but as a record, the way his whole trade keeps records. Proof that the work outlasts the people who fail to respect it. We spend so much of our lives deciding who in the room is worth slowing down for. We are so often, so confidently wrong. The old man fixing the lobby clock built the floor you are standing on. He usually did. He usually does. And the next time you catch yourself measuring a person by the wear on their boots, I'd ask you to remember that a building is only ever as honest as the quietest hands that built it. Those hands are almost never the ones wearing the expensive suit.